arte dell'arme, the Bolognese podcast where we discuss the intricacies of the Bolognese tradition. Today's guest is Martin Fabian.
Welcome to the Art of Arms podcast. Today we have a very special guest, the patron saint of HEMA, Mr. Martin Fabian. Martin, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, guys. Nice to meet you.
Thanks for joining us, Martin.
I'm happy to join you.
Yeah, so let's get started. This is, for me, this is particularly special because you have been sort of a North Star for me in the way that I've approached my HEMA training. In that as I was coming up in HEMA, your ability to combine both an athletic approach to training with interpretation and competition was always something that was really inspiring for me, and something that I always tried to model my own practice and my approach to HEMA around. So why don't you give us a little bit about your background and how you got started in Western martial arts?
All right, so this is quite an old story right now because roughly a month ago, I had an anniversary, 21 years of sword fighting. I would rather say sword fighting than HEMA or WMA, because here in Central Europe, or at least in Slovakia, the situation is a little different. Like there was a sort of a tradition of stage combat mostly, which is like very much alive. It's something similar to your Ren fairs and stuff like that, but maybe with more of the historical touch. So back when I was 15 years old, I was a huge fan of Lord of the Rings and all the fantasy books you can imagine. And as the movies came out, right, so I saw one of the local groups of historical fencing perform in the cinema, and I was looking at it and I was like, well, this is shit. So I would never do this. I would never do this. This is so lame, right? So, and in a few months I joined them, and I discovered that it's actually a lot of fun, and those guys are really cool. I was extremely lucky because my first instructor and my first teacher, he used to be one of the best guys around at that time, or at least in the things that we did back then. And back in 2003, we didn't distinguish much between like real historical techniques as we do now, right? Everything was the same thing. It was like a heavy mix, like an eclectic mix of everything you can imagine, but still in a good way. And for 3 years, I was like doing various performances. I was traveling through Europe and doing stage combat. So that was mostly it. But I was always interested more in fighting than in performing. And at around 2005, I got my hands on some fencing books which were available back then. I mean, it wasn't as easy as it is nowadays, because, of course, nowadays if somebody wants to get their hands on a fencing book, they just go to Wichtenauer and they can find anything, right? Right. I mean, even if it's not at Wichtenauer, usually most of the fencing books that we are aware right now that are already scanned and available. But back then you needed to know someone who knew someone else, and they had a CD, maybe a CD or something, and if they were kind enough, they copied the CD for you. So this is how I got my hands, and there were roughly, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 fencing books. There was Meyer, Sutor, and Talhofer, a few Talhofers, right? And I mean, I was looking at it, I was like, what is this? This doesn't look like the fencing I know. All right. So I tried to read Joachim Meyer, but it was extremely difficult back then. I mean, I knew German, or at least I understand German to a large degree, the modern one, but that was like really confusing. I'm not saying it's not confusing nowadays, because the way how Meyer writes is really special. But but then, then it took me another year until I met a huge inspiration of mine, or at least someone who helped me, helped to point me in the better direction. And that guy was Anton Kohutovic. Maybe you know him. I mean, he's also quite famous or popular, or he was like very influential at that time, and he lived roughly an hour away from me, but they were quite a secretive society back then. So but I managed to meet him, and we just exchanged some basic information, and I saw that he is really able to perform well, or at least like he was like very athletic, like the things he said and did were really nice. So I realized that these guys are probably, they had hit the mark, and I asked him for directions about like fencing books, because he was like a few steps ahead. So he pointed me towards things that we know nowadays as RDL, which is like Ringek, Danzig, Leo, and some other books. So with some hardships, I managed to get a few transcriptions, and I started doing like my own research. Doing the research was like trying to understand what they are talking about, and it was much easier than reading Joachim Meyer. So yeah, so I started making my own notes, but then I realized that the fencing books and the poem and all the commentaries that are available are so short that I will rather do the translation of the whole piece. So I was still living at the student dormitories in a campus, so I locked myself in with food and beer for 4 or 5 days.
The essentials, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Cruel fate.
And it took me about 4 or 5 days to translate the first compendium. It was like a compendium made out of the RDL plus Speer, plus some stuff from Pauskal and some stuff from what we know today as or what we knew back then as Dobringer. So, and that was probably the most important time for me, because everybody who has been working with the original sources, mainly if you try to translate it or like to read it in depth, then you will like get to know them really intimately. So that what happened. I mean, it really like moved me further in the whole understanding. I had 100 of these eureka moments. Everything suddenly started to make sense, right? And then I took the compendium and I went to some of my friends. I was like, guys, I have this thing, and you have to see it. And it's like here you are. So I just gave it away to a few of my friends. Yeah, and I formed my school, or what was about to become my school at a later date, right? So this was the beginning for me, and this was probably not probably, but this was 2007. So if I am to talk about HEMA or WMA specifically, for me it's from 2007 and on. And there was maybe another thing which was like very important, and I think this is what really differentiates HEMA from a lot of different things in life, is the internet, right? Or at least the international forums, which I sometimes really miss, because it was like such a cool place for exchange of information, like the old
stuff.
Such
great stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, you could, like suddenly I was doing a thing where I was communicating with people from all around the world. So it wasn't, of course, just me. It was like so many of these people who had all of these cool ideas and were often quite helpful. Sometimes not, but people gonna people.
Right.
People gonna people. So I think that was also very important, because I had this impression that I belong to something greater, that I'm a part of a very large community of like super driven, like, let's call us like researchers and scholars, and we're working on this together, and and we're discovering stuff. So it was like I don't know, I felt a bit like Indiana Jones.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, the whole sword nerd hit each other as a means of discovery. God, that is just something special.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. Wow, that's awesome.
So, when you were going through your compendium, I had this question pop up in my head as you were talking. Did you see different personalities kind of come out from like the different RDL authors?
Oh, of course, of course. I mean, this is something I also talk about in my latest book, which is not available in English, but it will be available in English in one day. That, for instance, there are a few masters which give you like this impression, like you can feel the author's persona coming from it. I mean, one of those is definitely like Dobringer, you know, or the guy who wrote it, whoever that was. I'm just using Dobringer because it's easier.
It's easy.
So I always imagined him like a really knowledgeable grandpa who has got, you know, like who's like very keen on sharing thoughts, and he's like a very good teacher. He was like super enthusiastic about the thing, and like I really wanted to meet him, right? And then the other guy who like struck me as a very interesting persona was the guy who copied or whatever the Speyer manuscript, or probably directly Hans von Speyer. It's probably the reason being that there are some personal remarks and personal notes that he that are a part of the manuscript itself, and you can feel like the person who was copying it also had quite some grasp about the thing, that they understood fencing to a certain degree. Yeah. And of course, there's also Johannes Leküchner, who was like a, I don't know, I don't want to sound rude, but he was like a very interesting persona if you think about it, like a priest who talks about like getting really paid for his job, you know, and not sharing for free and stuff like that. Yeah.
Got it.
Bagging people, playing backgammon, you know.
Yeah. And also like just going through his manuscript, like you can feel again that parts of the manuscript were probably written at a different time. And when I say different time, I don't mean like a month. Probably there are some years in between some of those parts. And like the first half is mostly a ripoff of Lichtenauer, but the second half is the real Leküchner, like where he like really talks about stuff that he really thinks. Okay, so not just, I don't know, like, okay, here's this Zornhauer trick, everybody knows it because that's how we do Zornhauer around here. Okay, but then he suddenly goes in all of these different techniques of his, and I'm not talking about grapples, just like his general approach towards Binden, Ansetzen, and all of this stuff. And of course Joachim Meyer, who was like a who was Joachim Meyer? No, he's like a super interesting persona. So I think that for people who are interested into fencing, even as a practical art, so you don't have to be like exactly a scholar or anything, but working with these sources can give you quite an insight on how those people thought, how they approached things, and you know, generally like what was the atmosphere around.
Yeah, I think that's been a huge approach for both Stephen and I in the way that we kind of have taken the Bolognese tradition, you know, and that's really the depth that we want to get into. And I want to talk to you a little bit about interpretation research later on, but before we get into that, I think, you know, one of the things that you've excelled at, and we'll start with this because I think it kind of helps to inform everything else, is your competition background. You know, with longsword, you know, I've got HEMA ratings pulled up. You've won 197 fights. You've lost 13 and you've tied 2. That's an incredible record, right? That's like absolutely unbelievable. But you haven't done that in a way where it's specifically been a, you know, not just like, you're not a sport fencer. Like, you don't go out there and just, you know, hop about. You're such a well-versed in terms of just understanding the text and the way that you approach fighting. Not that there's anything wrong with sport fencers or any of that. It's just, you know, you have this martial approach that I think is sort of renowned. So how do you approach training from a physical standpoint and developing yourself to kind of get into that? What does a peak week of training look like for Martin Fabian?
Okay, so in a way, I see myself as a sport fencer.
Yeah.
but not like a, well, perhaps not like most people understand. Okay, so most people see it as a derogatory term, right? So
Right.
where it means something like dirty. But I always approach the thing as a sport. I wanted to be seen as a sportsman, or like or perhaps I even prefer the term like combat sports, because I think this kind of approach, or at least this kind of a mindset forms your whole approach. All right. So as I wanted to be seen as someone who does something seriously, because I mean I so much of my time is given to, or was given towards fencing and such, that I really wanted to be taken seriously. So that's why I spent like countless hours. I was really like there were times when I was like really practicing every day of the week for a few hours, right? And I'm not like boasting. That was the reality. So I used to fence like for at least 2 or 3 hours a day, every single day. And my approach, well, maybe that's the difference between nowadays, because of course times have changed a bit and people move. But let's say my original approach when we were like discovering things were just endless practice with various people, and we weren't exactly spectacular in what we did, or the things that we did back then compared to modern standards are quite obsolete right nowadays. But you know, for instance, every single session I did at least 20 or 30 minutes of footwork, endless footwork exercises, just walking here and there, trying to work on my form, trying to perfect the form, trying to perfect all the cuts that I'm doing. All right, so it wasn't just sparring. I mean, a lot of people nowadays, they just go and spar, I mean, which is a lot of fun. But for me, it was I tried to have a more structured approach, where every day I'm doing some footwork, some cutting just into air, some basic cutting exercises with my partners, and then we go through each individual technique, right? So that was back then. Then after protective gear was made available, or let's say widely available, we started doing sparring. But again, it will sound a bit weird, but now I'm not the greatest fan of sparring as such. Or at least I see it as a tool more than a goal. All right, so I did spar, but not as much as someone would imagine. I mostly sparred or prepared for tournaments when I was going to them. And nowadays, again, it's very different. So for instance, I do a lot of physical exercises, like besides fencing. So it's not just fencing for me, and a lot of those are like complementary for some stuff. So I do cycle a lot. I have I do a lot of hiking. I have a dog, so I walk a lot. All right, so that's my cardio nowadays. Yeah. And besides of that, I do a lot of physical workout. So that means just hitting the gym and lifting the weights and stuff. I used to do, well, not as much nowadays, but I used to do a lot of high intensity interval training. Well, it really depends, a lot of things, like everything you can imagine under that. And besides it, I usually spend, let's say, 20 to 30 minutes like doing or working on some topic with a partner. One of the problems nowadays is as time has become very precious and there's not as much of it as there used to be. So I'm mostly teaching again, so there's not a lot of time for me. So I'm doing individual courses or lectures for my students. So I'm trying to structure it in a way it's also beneficial for me. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, I do some sparring, or at least I'm trying to do some sparring every week, at least for an hour or two. Right. This is another thing. I briefly already touched this subject, but I'm a huge proponent of the approach of learning by teaching. Okay, and the reason why I'm a proponent of this is because it couldn't have been different. I wish I had a teacher, right? So since I didn't have a teacher who could like teach me everything about HEMA, the only way for me was to conceptualize it by teaching, right? So I sometimes joke that my club is like an experimental group for me. And the sole reason for its creation is that I can have people interacting with each other and just looking like, oh, if I teach them this, like, how does it look like? Because, if you, all the time, if you put something or give something into the wild, it takes its own shape and its own life, and you can see how people tackle it. So I'm quite a spectator in this, and I'm always like looking at how people solve various problems, and that has been always my biggest inspiration. Fencing is also a bit different to other sports, also because it's quite an intellectual sport, I think, or it's like a intellectual activity. So past a certain point, athleticism isn't everything. Like, in order to be successful, you really need to think about what you're doing. You need to think about the strategies. You need to think about approaches. You need to be able to analyze your opponent like really, really fast, right? So I think a lot about fencing, and mainly when I'm like watching my students or like watching other people perform, right? The physical part just comes naturally from it, I think.
Yeah.
Or at least now.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that, because I have this idea for something that I want to write in the near future, and the question is like, how would sort of the authors have seen the idea of mastery, right? And if you look at Marazzo and Manciolino in particular, one of the things that they very specifically talk about is that somebody who is a master, like, not saying that you are a master, but because I know people get really weird about that. But the idea that how would they have viewed a master is a master is somebody who teaches, and you judge a master based on the quality of their students. And I think it's Marazzo even talks about how somebody can be a really great fencer. Actually, I think it's Manciolino, because it's a really scathing remark. He talks about how somebody can be a really great fencer, but if they can't teach their students and if they can't develop their students, then they'll never be a master, right? And that's such an interesting concept and paradigm, and I see it as being incredibly beneficial to like development. So, have you seen your fencing or your understanding of fencing improve as you've really taken that focus on watching your students, paying attention to how they're moving and things like that?
Absolutely, it's absolutely crucial. This is like everybody has got their limits, right? And no matter how good we are, there are certain limits. But when you have a group of people, all of those have like different limits. They have their different ways of how they tackle problems. So I think we will always be as good as the people around us. All right. So the better people around us, the more it will influence us. And I think like the quote that you said about the master being someone who can raise students. This is absolutely true, right? This is absolutely true. Without our students, we would be nowhere. So
yeah. So as you've taken that training into competition, since you do have such a sort of a prestigious competition record, I mean, you're probably one of the most decorated fencers in HEMA history to this point. And how do you view and approach competition, both as a tool, but also as a competitor? Like, how do you develop that mindset, and where do you kind of like focus when you're preparing for competition?
So a competition for me was always a place where I could kind of prove my philosophy, where I could like prove my approach, or at least put it into a test against different approaches. So to see as I'm right. I understand that people have like very varying views of that, and some people, of course, prefer just to spar or not to spar at all, and some people really prefer to do competitions. But for me, it was always the best test we can take, right? I mean, we cannot fight to death nowadays, and I'm very happy about it.
But surely
I very much
somebody
enjoy
needs to at some point.
I very much enjoy living, and
Yeah.
it's like, even if you study the sources, even if you try to practice accordingly, like to the sources, even our ancestors, for them, like a competition or a game, I think a game would be a better term, was the best way how to prepare for war, because there is no better way, right? In war,
Right.
people die, and you don't want to die, of course, And some of the techniques, which are like a little bit more complex, I think that the only way of how they came to be was that people just tested them so much in a, this playful environment that they were able to perfect them, right? So, therefore, even for me, like nowadays, a competition or a tournament will be like the highest point or the pinnacle of the art. But I'm not saying it's like the most important. I'm just saying like it's the pinnacle where you can go to, and where you can really test something. And my preparation for that was usually brief. usually very brief, because it's like, I mean, you practice for the thing all year long, but just
Right.
before the tournament, I mean, I usually dedicated a few training sessions for some sparring, for some special tournament preparation exercises, but not much, because I don't want it for it to interfere with our usual topics. So really not much, yeah. And I always, it's not easy to compete, and everybody knows that. I mean, there's a lot of stress connected to competing. I mean, just with the travel, usually you don't sleep too well before the competition, and if you do compete in multiple categories, it takes you quite some time during the day, and it's like very stressful. So in the end, you're more fighting yourself than you're fighting the other guys. So the other guys are like bonus, right? So I think it was always also a proof or a way to test myself against this kind of environment, to be able to keep my cool. And of course, I didn't succeed every time. And that's why I was like always interested into the thing. That's why I wanted to prove something. And of course, the testosterone, right? We're men. And testosterone is like... quite something which like moves our lives up to some degree, and we always want to be the biggest dog on the playground, as they say, right? So that was important for me for some time, but after some time it was like, when I proved everything to myself, I was just I just went there to have fun, and I wish I would just go to places, have fun from the very start, because then it becomes even better.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Like I agree with that mindset. It's a lot different. I think in my own practices, I've kind of transitioned away from like serious competition into like going to events and teaching and lecturing. I have a lot more fun at events, just because I get to interact with people. You can free spar with somebody and there's nothing at stake, but you get to really kind of explore things in a different way. But I think that there is, like you said, there's just that kind of like that drive to get to that place. And it opens a lot of doors too, right? Being able to compete at that level and kind of like take things, one of the things about competition, and you kind of alluded to it, where you kind of want to test like your interpretations and your ideas and use it as that kind of that testing ground, that playground. One of the things that I remember very early in seeing your videos for the first time, which, are absolutely phenomenal. Do you have a background in like media production?
No.
Oh man, you're a talented artist. Yeah.
No, it was just always my hobby. Like art runs through our family, so I was always quite interested into visual hobbies. I mean, I took a different course in the university, but I'm still doing art to a large degree. Like I still do photography, let's say semi-professionally. Like I do photography for Siggy. Like all the photos that you can see are mine.
Cool.
But I'm not like a graduated artist. No.
I mean, sometimes the best, as an amateur researcher, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes the best things come from people who don't have the degrees. I don't know. But one of the things that really stood out early on, as I was watching your videos, is that you were one of the first people that I ever saw that really figured out and really emphasized connecting the body with the sword in a way. Like you took Lichtenauer, like fence with your whole body very seriously. And like you embodied that. Like how do you take something like that interpretation? I mean, you were talking a lot about sort of like your preparation ahead of time, practicing footwork, practicing movement and everything like that in terms of your training and how, it was the training of an entire year that led into a competition. And it was the focus on fundamentals. Like, how do you kind of mold that together? And how did you really kind of like figure that out? Because you've done it better than I think a lot of people have.
You're very kind, and thank you. But there are just so many good people. I mean,
for sure.
Yeah, I mean. I just made videos, I think that was the main differentiator between me and between other people. But like I said, I think a lot of these things come from my mind because I was addicted to fencing, or maybe I still am, and I was just thinking about it a lot. Just like trying to make it work. Like trying to analyze my opponents, like what they are doing and like how to do some things, It's like even with art, you don't have to be a studied or a graduated photographer in order to be good, And usually the difference between a good and a bad photographer, and of course that's not 100%, but usually the difference is 100,000 photos, right? So and it's the same with fencing. It's like a practical art. Okay, so I just spent so much time with everything, and as time went on, I was just trying to like kind of perfect everything. All right, so like again, we're coming back to the topic where I have my students and where I'm observing how things work, right? And maybe this is the main difference, or this is like very important when you try to approach. When you try to approach historical fencing from a practical perspective, is a lot of people project their ideas onto what they are like reading, okay? And this is like generally, I think that if we are to blame someone, it shouldn't be us. We should blame the historical masters, right?
What did they know anyway?
Right. Yeah, it's like if you read Joachim Meyer, I mean, you can really feel his personality leaking from the manuscript, right? He's telling you stuff like, oh, you shouldn't gamble, you shouldn't, run for girls, you shouldn't do all this stuff, or I don't know, whatever. And then, oh, this is, and he's like really strict in the way. And then you get impressions about like, oh, this is fencing. I should be a saint. I should, behave like this. I should pray every morning to Saint George, But
so
that's not how it works.
Fencing.
Oh yeah, man.
Fencing without joy.
He was such a doofus, this guy. I mean, he was great, and we can be grateful for a lot of things. But I also think that he's to blame for a lot of things that came, right? And so. Right. People read fencing books and they get impressions of like, this is how fencing should look like, okay? You read everything about Zonhauer, and this is the thing, always do it with your left foot forward, and you're like, okay. And then, as you start doing the things, then you realize that sometimes, I'm always standing with the right foot forward. Oh, I'm certainly doing something wrong, right? Because the old masters, they say these things. So I think that there comes a point in every fencer's life when you should like compare and evaluate what you are doing versus what is written, and understand that not everything what is written is true, right? Like those masters, they didn't have the patent for truth. They weren't necessarily everything they said was true, or there were some reasons why they said it. Perhaps they said it because someone else said it to them, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So again, like we have this corpus of Johannes Lichtenauer and his art. Okay, and he's talking about so much stuff, right? But then again, he might just be a very specific view into fencing. It might not be really a good example of how fencing really went on, right? He was just one of many guys. So then I think when you realize that contextually a lot of things might be different, and when you free yourself from trying to really like embody some not existing ideal, then you will start to see fencing, as it is. And once you start seeing fencing as it is, and when you realize that, okay, let's say the weak part of a sword can be a lot of different things, or a certain position or a certain attack can look differently in different scenarios, then you're really starting to get it. Or at least that's what I think, right? Because for some people you need to have like a very specific formal way of approaching fencing. So let's say you always step to here, you always turn like this, etc., etc. But that's not how fencing works if you really try to like practically do it, right? So when you accept the melange, when you accept the variety, the spice of fencing, then it really starts to talk to you, right? And so that's the approach I'm trying to have in order to be able to understand everything like a bit more than the fencing books are saying, right? So I think when people really realize and disconnect slightly and just stop caring a little, then fencing will emerge on its own,
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So I mean, you almost approach this as, you're taking specific data points from different authors and almost feeding them into your own experience, and kind of creating, almost your own gloss in your mind, right? In terms of like how you perceive it, because that's what the glosses are. I mean, for the most part, it's, different guys at different times, kind of inciting their own personality into something that they're learning, and then their perception of it, I always wanted to do a little comedy bit with Ringek, Danzig, and Lev standing around a table, and they're making pancakes in the morning, and they're reading like a Martha Stewart cookbook or something like that, and they're arguing over whether or not they should whip the eggs in, stir the eggs in, or kind of fold the eggs into the pancakes, because that's basically the difference between the glossiers, is that you might just have like different terms, and then when it's completely taken out of its original context, and then you just hand it to people and they're looking at it randomly for the first time, they're like, well, he says to leap, and instead it says step here. So is it a step or is it a leap? Or is a leap a step? And it gets like, people get in their heads and they get really, really confused.
So this is what I did at some point, because of course when you teach and when you have beginners, they're asking you a lot of questions and stuff like, oh, how should I step here and there, or should I use this step instead of this step? So at one point I said to myself, I will never give like concrete examples of what to do. I will just say them like, do what you feel is necessary. Like to do whatever you want, right? Like don't really think about doing like a certain step in a certain way, but rather try to act naturally. Okay, try to do what you need to do in order to do it, and you are not going to be wrong, right? Like if you can perform the feat, if you can perform the technique, it doesn't matter if you did a 45 degree or 60 degree-ish step towards the side, right? Yeah. It's also like there's this other thing. I think you briefly touched the subject with Joeli in the podcast last week. Lichtenauer, I absolutely love the thing that Lichtenauer did, because I think that the system that he based is absolutely crucial and important for fencing development, and it was like probably very influential in all of Germany or Central Europe, or even in Southern Europe, whatever. But then again, we may have like a very skewed perception of the thing, and what skews our perception is the quantity. Okay, so there is this like a fake quantity, and in the end, it doesn't, it might seem from our point of view that, oh Jesus, Lichtenauer was everywhere. It was like every home had a copy of Lichtenauer, and they were, it was next to the Bible. He was the
Every Bible had a copy of
But because there is like 16 copies or how many? I mean, I don't even remember right now. But all of those like come from 150 or 200 years, which is like a lot of time. That's a lot of time, and probably the reason why those copies exist is because, I don't know, maybe he was a scholar. Maybe he had good friends who preserved it, and then and he did a good marketing for it, so people were just copying. So we sort of like see the thing like differently how it was. Even Meyer is a very good example. So there is this great research being done right now on Joachim Meyer. Like so many great knowledge about his life has come onto the surface. So I'm really happy to be reading stuff about it. And one of the really formative ideas for me was that back in 2011 or 12, I was doing a lecture at Tyrnhau, which is like a event that Anton and friends are organizing here in Slovakia. And I was doing a lecture on Joachim Meyer's life, right? So I wrote to Olivier Dupois, and I asked him if I can use his article about Meyer. Well, he made that he made back at that time. And as I was translating it with my zero knowledge of French, so I discovered. I mean. Maybe the numbers are not going to be like super precise because it was a long time ago, but I discovered that during a 10-year long time when Meyer lived in Strasbourg, he organized around 8 fencing schools, right? I mean, he was allowed to organize them. And then in the very same paper, like Olivier was writing that during the same time, there was about 800 of these fencing schools taking place, right? or at least in the 20 years around Meyer, right, or something like that.
Right.
And there was this other guy whose name was Wiegand Brack, and also he did more fencing schools than Joachim Meyer. And there was this another guy who made like 30. All right. So then I started asking like who was this guy? Like, was he even good? Probably he was. Most probably he was, because we know that he
got hired by the Duke.
Yeah, but he was just, one of many. He was like a fish in a pond of like hundreds and hundreds. And we're still talking just about one city, about Strasbourg. This is just one city. And there was like 50 of these huge cities just in the area of Western, Eastern, Southern Germany or whatever, where fencing was taking place almost daily. There wasn't just Talhofer and the Gesellschaft of Lichtenauer. There was probably 1,000 of guys like that who were just fencing all of the time, right? So Lichtenauer, maybe he was just the one who wrote a book, right? Yeah. He was the one who had the means to write a book, and if you read Döbringer, there are a few personal remarks like, a lot of people say that Lichtenauer's art is like very funny. It's like, they say that when you are attacking from Winden, that's not a really good attack, but I want to see those people that all they do is just they are trying to overrun a rabbit or whatever, stuff like that. So, and this is a very interesting tidbit, because it gives you the information that there were people who were criticizing him. So this is the real message, right? I mean, of course, if you're a true believer, a Lichtenauer believer, you're, of course, Lichtenauer is the best. Yeah, I mean, he was never wrong. But in reality, he was being criticized. Even in that time, a lot of people were saying, oh, the stuff you teach is crap, right? And I mean, probably wasn't, but maybe was, like we will never know. We will never know. So.
Right.
So we should always approach these things with a grain of salt, because these guys were absolutely phenomenal in making marketing for themselves, right? But they are not the pinnacle of fencing as such.
Yeah. No, that's you're absolutely right. I mean, there's almost a survivor bias, right? In terms of these are the people who actually did publish something. Like if you look at Marazzo, right? Marazzo is kind of like the quintessential like Bolognese author, and everybody looks at Marazzo, and even when I write an article about Marazzo, we get like 3 times as much traffic on something that I write about Marazzo than anybody else, right? Because everybody there's that name recognition, and it's like even Marazzo,
he's not that
good. he's really not, and he's like
he had pictures.
He talks about his marketing in his book, and he talks about how like specific his attempt at marketing was, and he talks to his son Sebastian. It was written for Sebastian, but there's secrets that he wrote about that were like for hundreds of years were secrets. Like he talks about how the Segno, you should like in the book that he wrote, he tells his son, hey, by the way, if you're teaching the footwork on the Segno, make sure that there's nobody else there watching so they don't take your secrets. I'm going to give you all this information in this book that I'm writing right now, and I'm going to publish it. Like, what are you doing, man?
Yeah.
But
I mean, I
have
to confess. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, like, had he not done that, then we probably would have never known.
We can't beat a lead that's Martin Fabian confessing, so please.
Sorry. I have quite some issues getting into the Italian sources. Just because of the way how they write. It's just so pompous, right? It's like it takes them 11 pages just to get to the point, right?
Yeah,
it's just
for sure.
So difficult.
Yes,
but I'm trying.
I prefer to do all my translations to eliminate all of the like all the stuff, and just get to he said this. It's really easy to read, actually.
So do you feel like Fabris kind of like broke things down a little bit more for his German audience and
Fabris was a genius. Fabris
Yeah.
was a genius. I mean, his book is like, there are a few books where you can really feel the guys were really good, like they knew what they're actually talking about. Okay.
So this is what I wonder. If Fabris was go. Sorry, I thought you were done. Go ahead.
No problem. Like Fabris and Giganti, well, talking about rapier, like this is exactly where I get the feel like these guys knew what they were talking about. Like some of the concepts that Fabris is like opening in his book, like a touchless bind, and stuff like this. This is like this is like space science. If fencing was, science, I mean, this is like space science. He was like so much ahead of everyone, like in his concepts. I mean, of course, he took it to the extreme. I mean, we will probably never know. Maybe he was senile in his later years. Like that's why he like really took it to the extreme. But still, the way he gives his intro, it's one of the best like theoretical intros to fencing in general. And also like Giganti is like so much on spot. If you read Giganti, it's like this guy probably killed people. This guy saw a lot of shit happen. So he was like, oh, I said, do this. Okay, do this. I mean, people say, or these little remarks like, every master is teaching all of these beautiful, nice techniques, but in the end, when 2 idiots go bashing at each other, they just, bash the swords again against each other, So, this is the historical master's voice.
You really do need to read it if you want to, I think, understand like point fencing. Because I think the like Fabris and Giganti, like their understanding of how points interact and how the geometries they create are just mind blowing.
Even the way how Giganti describes tempo, it's probably the best descriptions of tempo there is. It's simplistic. It's just so simple. You see, he understood it, because usually when people cannot describe something in an easy way, they probably don't really understand. Exactly. And there's Gigante like every finite movement is a tempo. If you move your foot, it's a tempo. If you don't attack, it's a tempo. And it's like, yeah,
we got
that's it.
That's it.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, to be fair, I feel like that's, to me, I've always, because my first experience to HEMA was through RDL, I've always seen the word indes as probably the most brilliant expression of tempo ever.
Yeah.
And I know that's going to really make some people mad,
totally
but if you think of it as in between, you just move in between whatever action it is that your opponent takes. It could be in between the motion of their foot, their hand, whatever. You just go in between. Marazzo, Manciolino, they say the same thing.
And it's
all the
hard
rapier
to,
masters say the same thing.
It's hard to teach without teaching the idea of forward knock, even if you're teaching Italian, which is basically get him reacting to you, or you're reacting to him, create the situation where he can now react to you. You can't beat the pure simplicity of that idea, and that it's never expressed clearly in the Bolognese sources. Mm-hmm. It's implied.
Mm-hmm.
Have you read the Anonymous Vienna?
The one which was found, what was it, like 5 years ago or so?
Yeah, the one that Tom Leone found.
Yes, I've read it, but I don't remember much from it.
The reason I was asking is because I know a lot of people have, people who are very passionate about Fabris have really kind of attached themselves to that text in particular. Which, by the way, like your videos on rapier fencing, there was the first time I ever did a rapier tournament. I just adhered to the things that you had taught in your rapier videos, because I was doing longsword and I was doing side sword, and so I was going into a rapier and dagger tournament, and I had never really done anything with rapier sources specifically. So I stuck to those and adhered to those to a T, and I went into that tournament and I tried my best to fence like Fabris, and I finished 5th in my first rapier tournament, rapier and dagger. Yeah, just sticking to those videos. It was, and everybody's. I had conversations afterwards, and I was like, I feel bad because I'm not really a rapier fencer, and one guy comes up to me and he goes, "Yeah, I know, I can tell." I was like,
well, there's this phenomenon that you just described, which is happening, like. It's often people who don't do a particular weapon or a style that are successful in that weapon or a style at tournaments, right? And I was in Mexico, what was it, like 2 months ago, roughly 2 months ago, and those guys had a few tournaments at their event, and one of those events or one of those tournaments or categories was the sword and buckler, right? And it was one of the nicest tournaments I've ever seen, like generally by how people fought, how they approach it, and also the level which they were fighting at was really comparable to, let's say, a Central European level or whatever. Like those guys would probably do really good also in our tournaments, right? And what was the reason? Like they were performing so well?
What?
Nobody practiced it. Nobody. And this is like again, we made a full circle back to the topic. Like sometimes if you really let go of some concepts that you are trying to embody, sometimes if you really are just trying to perform, like really making an attack, right? Then suddenly you embody the principles in a better way than when you are just trying to formally imitate something, right? So when you say that some person said to you that that they can see that you're not a rapier fencer. Like, what does it even mean today? Like, I understand that from a formal point of view. I mean, you can see that people position themselves in a certain way, etc., etc. But I think we are already like past that point, and we understand that, like, in order to fight as a rapier fencer, you don't necessarily have to stand always in a certain way. You just have to work with certain principles in a certain way. And the less you try to work your mind around, like, looking like a rapier fencer, the more you will be successful. And that also goes for longsword in general, right? Like, this is another experiment I'm doing. I hope that none of my guys are gonna listen to this podcast. Past a certain point, I stopped teaching people historical names or names of techniques. So if you asked like an average guy from my school, like, okay, perform a Kurzhau, or even go into a Schrankhut, I mean, they would have some hard time doing what you want them to do, and probably they would not be able to do what you want from them. But if you saw them fighting, or if you saw them performing, they are able to use all of these techniques and things, okay? Because I'm not trying to burden their mind with concept. I'm rather, with this formal concepts, I'm rather trying to teach them to be able to think tactically or strategically, and to employ various approaches in their practical fencing, all right? And that doesn't make them any less of any guy who can name every single technique. I would say quite the opposite, because they are able to use it as it is supposed to be used, without the need to, formalize every single step of what they are doing, right?
Sure.
So
that's
yeah, sorry.
That's interesting, because I feel like in a modern context, we tend to, people will hear that and they'll say that's heretical, or you're taking the H out of HEMA. But we have, I'm not, so the thing is we actually have historical examples of people doing just that, right? Stephen right now, he's working on a translation of Altoni, and for a long time we've had Vigiani around, and it seems as though there was a push in the 1550s in Italy to take a lot of the sort of colloquial nature of naming guards and attacks and things, and expressing them in a way that everybody could understand. Vigiani, he was writing for Charles V's court, and eventually Maximilian II, and he was writing to a German audience, and instead of naming the guards with their local names that made sense to everybody, Porta di Ferro or Coda Lunga Stretta, he gave them simple tactical names, and that's his guard name convention. If you look at Altoni and what Stephen has done with Altoni is, I think, going to change a lot of the way that people see Italian fencing. It might be a good source for you, since well, actually no, he goes on some pretty long diatribes. He's pretty dense at points. Yeah. but one of the nice things about the way that he does things is he does simplify things down, and he basically gives you 9 guards, 3 high guards, 3 middle guards, and 3 low guards. Right. And they're named in a very simple naming convention. And the idea is, and I think this is the idea, is not just conveying it to another audience, but also reducing that sort of tactical lag, right? Because if your mind has to go through, I'm standing in Cinghiare Porta di Ferro, and I'm going to throw a punta in falso and drive this thrust, by that time you're already hit in the face, Yeah. Nobody's going to go through all that in the course of a fencing match tactically. But if you actually give somebody, this person is in a low left guard, they're defensive, and their only attack is really is with a thrust. Otherwise, they're giving you a big tempo. If you can understand that, and you can kind of work through that very quickly, you're going to have an advantage over all of your opponents. So I see that for people who want to, throw shade at that approach, it's a historical approach. We have evidence of it happening all over the place.
Well, even Italian rapier kind of evolved into this, right?
Right.
It's just like prima, seconda, terza, quarta, and then you just, turn into another prima, seconda, terza, or quarta. It's like I sometimes joke that if my sole job was to teach fencing, and if I was to live by teaching fencing, I would most probably just teach like Kuchner. Because there's just so much techniques that you can teach it for years and years. Most of it is crap, but you can make a good living out of it because you can, create a curriculum for years to come. But if I was to teach somebody how to fight, I would probably teach them Di Grassi because
Yeah. Yeah.
Again, it's something which is exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, dude, this is like my favorite source of for Spadone or Montante, right? I mean, 2 pages.
Yep.
2 pages. and it's like, I mean, I wouldn't probably say this 15 years ago, because 15 years ago I really needed the system. I needed to understand the logic, and I mean, I'm not trying to like diminish the way like how some people do it, because I think it's perfectly fine. But this is the difference, that at some point all you need to do, or all the information that you need, is laid out in 2 pages. Like, yeah, if you're fighting, a lot of guys, just turn the sword like crazy all over the place, and try to do these attacks which are like comfortably done one from another.
Right.
And then if you're fighting one guy, don't really cut, just trusted him, and that's it. I mean, but he's right? I mean, what else you need just to?
I mean, for most
if you want to fight someone, right? Yeah. I mean, this is it. This is fighting. This is also why really the Dobringer, or whoever that was, like, really stands out, because he just repeats all the same stuff throughout the manuscript. He just says, just throw attacks, throw one after another, and attack as much as you can, all right? And do not defend yourself. But if you need to defend, immediately attack back. And that's it.
Right.
That's basically the corpus of fighting, right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, if you want to be successful, you need to eat just bread for a few weeks and drink water, and that's it. That's what Talhofer would say. Yeah, that was a joke.
Yeah.
I mean, it reminds me of, and I think you alluded to this earlier in Giganti's second book. He talks about how, like, once you're well-trained in the Sal, he said that you need to go out and fight a drunk person in the street, because they're going to throw natural blows. And your parries, when you get into an earnest fight versus like fighting in the Sal, fighting in the Sal, everything is so like you're
streamlined, right?
And everything is tight. Everything is done with a specific amount of minutia, because the danger is kind of taken away from you a little bit. But then you get into an earnest fight, and then all of a sudden you start overreacting. That's always been my argument for why like competition is such an important thing for historical research. Like without tournament and without competition in the sport aspect of HEMA, we would lose that adrenaline approach, and we would basically turn into karate. Not that there's anything wrong with karate, but you see people with their like really finite movements, and they're like, throwing very punches, and everything is very structured in a way. And then you throw that person into an MMA ring, and they fight somebody who, is a bare knuckle boxer and does like BJJ, and they just like rip them to shreds, or maybe something more stylized like Aikido or something like that, It's like we, without that sport aspect and kind of having the different pillars that we can kind of follow and really kind of look at this from every single angle, I think that we could easily lose the soul of what this is. At
the end of the day, it's fighting. At the end of the day, it's fighting. And if tournaments and sparring is the best we have, then we need to utilize it, of course. But at the same time, and this is again the greatest advantage of HEMA, like no matter what you prefer, if you just prefer to dig into sources. If you really want to understand history and historical context, there's just so much stuff you can go into, and even if you just repeat the very basic research, like taking up Lichtenauer for the first time, or whatever, Anonimo Bolognese for the first time, and just going through it, you can absolutely do it, and there's so much you can do with it. All right, if you just wanna, I don't know, beat the out of each other, then you can just go and do it. If you know.
So I think the thing, it's a trip. Like when you do the historical research, I think the one thing that blew my mind the most was how many hit points people had back in the days. Like, I mean, we have people getting freaking mangled and they're still fighting, and then it really kind of shows so much why the masters, at least the Italians, really prefer you either hit people in the head, stab them in the face, or cut them in the hands, and everything else is just sort of like extra credit.
This is something I was thinking about lately. Like, we already know that hitting the hands was like a dick move, right?
Yeah, it's totally a dick move. Yeah.
So it's a very
but it's what you do if your life depends on it. Yeah.
So, but then again, like, what about hitting the legs? Like, I think that was like a high dick move, right? So,
yeah.
I don't really think that these things didn't exist. It's not like, people in the medieval times, they were like, okay, guys, so what about hitting legs? And they were like, hitting legs? What do you mean?
Oh, yeah, no.
It doesn't exist in this reality. So, for them, they were they were the same people as we are. They were trying to game the rules.
Right.
They were trying to do all kinds of stuff. And
100%.
And absolutely, some of the, if somebody uses their hands for their everyday job, and, having a broken finger or a broken arm in 1450s is something very different to having a broken arm right now. I know American healthcare, that's like similar to medieval times in this regard.
Only if you're poor, man. Otherwise, it's great.
So, but like jokes aside, I think that the legs were even more important to them. I think the absence of leg attacks, or at least for the common folk, is connected more to this than to anything else, right? So I mean,
right.
I'm 1,000,000% sure it existed, but they just didn't use it because it was like an ultra dick move. Like, nobody in your village spoke to you for a week if you did it.
Right, like for fun fencing. Yeah.
And then everything changed at some point. Yeah. Sorry.
Well, Stephen and I had this conversation with the Discord, the Bolognese Discord the other day. We were talking about how do you incorporate cultural context, because cultural context is really important, and we were talking about how to incorporate cultural context into fencing, and one of the things about like Italian fencing in general is there's a certain range where if you were to step away from your opponent, you would be shamed from ever showing your face in Italian society again. So like when Manciolino says that you perform a stringere of space and you gather into measure on somebody, you're basically telling them that they either attack you or they exile themselves from whatever city that it is that you're in, and walk away in shame as a coward. And it's like, how do you simulate that in a fencing environment?
Right.
Like,
well, you create these rules, man, and everybody has to oblige them.
Right. That's the tough part, because the whole Bolognese thing is about trying to control their sword, and then they just step back, and you're like, well, it works.
So, I mean, that's one of the things where, like, as much as the more we understand about, I think the cultural context, the more we get a depth of understanding of why certain things were done. Like what are some of the things that you found in your own personal research that have kind of related to things that have changed your mind about like the RDL tradition in particular?
I think everything is connected. So I'm not like a early Lichtenauer guy necessarily, or at least in this way. I think discovering more about the context of the things, For instance, recently if you remember, Dirk Hagedorn was able to decipher this passage that was always in front of our eyes, and nobody, and I really feel stupid because of it, because like, how could I look at it all the time and not try to decipher it myself? So but Dirk did an amazing job, and he deciphered the text. And so now understand this. So we're reading this very Lichtenauer fencing book, which tells you that and markets itself as the best thing ever, and so secret, and so verboten and stuff like that. And suddenly, in the middle of the book, from all the wonderful Lichtenauer techniques, all the Schielhaus, all the complex Duplieren, Winden, whatever, there's this stupidest technique ever, where a guy is like cutting to the other side, right? And the other guy is like doing a slice or whatever. I mean, that was right. And in that place, the scribe or whoever was the author of the book needed to write things like, haha, and this is how Bertolt bested Thalhofer. And you're like what? I mean, it's a very cool tidbit, which shows us that these guys had some kind of rivalry, or I don't know why they hated poor Thalhofer so much, but whatever. But at the same time, like, why? From all the things that they could have written in that book, why in particular with this were they like alluding to this crappy situation? And then probably when the guy was past his writing hangover the next day, he was like, oh, this is a shitty way or shitty thing to say. So they just scratch it out, or someone who was supervising the thing said like, oh, just leave it out rather, because it might cause some harm. So it's like tidbits like this, which put us again into a very specific, which like imply these questions, like who were these guys really, right? I mean, like Joeli, and there is also some other research which is coming, but like the things that Joeli presented in his research shed these lights, on this situation. And I think if we understand who these guys were, why they were doing these particular things, it will help us to be better fencers in the end, because we will realize that, okay, so Lichtenauer was just this dude who had this like circle jerk around him, and maybe just, it worked for them. Maybe they even didn't teach this like, publicly. So, okay, so sometimes if I step with my right foot in front of my left, and I do a different motion, maybe I'm not doing anything wrong, because, Lichtenauer had a very limited view, etc., etc. So all these little tidbits that we can find about their lives, and also the Joachim Meyer, for instance. I often laugh because there are so many funny things about Joachim Meyer, but at the same time, he was a madman. He was like really into fencing.
Yes,
and he was really into fencing, and he wrote so many fencing books, and we can see like how that guy evolved in his understanding of fencing, right? How his opinions changed. Like, for instance, I was thinking recently about this like the München book that was like uncovered last year. So he's teaching a Schielhau, but with crossed arms, right? And he's like saying like, this is a true Schielhau, whatever, right? And what if the guy just interpreted Schielhau wrong? What if he really interpreted it wrong in his initial years? I don't know, maybe he was 21 or 22 by the time, and or maybe he just wanted to be special, so he said, oh, screw the Lichtenauer Schielhau, this is much better, whatever. And then after a few years, he got back to the idea of teaching like Schielhau normally. I mean, he also uses the crossed arm Schielhau in his gründliche Beschreibung, but he came around and he started to be like more like that. So I think really understanding the context, understanding that all of these guys were just people like us. They were also interpreting to a large degree. Many of them didn't have like a direct connection to Lichtenauer, and then again, who was Lichtenauer in the end, right? So I think all of this like helps us to push our understanding more. If we understand what we are doing, then we will probably have even more fun with it. Like maybe one more example about it, like if I don't know, some apocalypse happened, and if in 500 years they would dig out the paintball pistols, right? I mean, maybe they would argue so much about the art of paintball and discover so many things. But if you just told them like listen, people had a lot of fun with paintball. I mean, it is shooting, but at the same time, it's not really shooting, but it's still shooting. You know what I mean, right? So and they would be like, like screw it, let's just have fun. Like dude, it's Sunday, the mass just ended. Let's go behind the church and do some fencing, and all the wives will be like, oh no. They're gonna be drunk again, I mean, of course, I'm making fun of it right now. Of course, fencing was also used to preserve your life and for defense, but this is another important thing, and it doesn't matter if it's a Italian source or a German source. The later a fencing book came into existence, the different fencing was, right? What began as activity for a specific group of people who devolved, who were like bred and raised to fight, and they were really dying en masse in battlefields and then after a few years, after a few decades, fencing became a widespread civilian activity, right? Then it also transformed even into a more of a game, but of course at the same time, I mean, it was becoming more and more obsolete on the battlefield because other weapons were taking place. So fencing is strange in that regard, and I think like being able to accept all the different phases of fencing, and of course it's not just sport, but also the martial side, also the, let's say the ceremonial side of it. I mean, it's important for you to be able to holistically approach everything that we do.
Cool. Yeah, that's a great synopsis. So let's kind of wrap this up and talk a little bit about Sigi swords and the vision behind Sigi swords, because you guys have absolutely taken HEMA by storm. Since Sigi launched, it's become the gold standard. I think that before Sigi, most of the clubs that I interacted with, their default longsword was a Reginier, and there's nothing wrong with Reginier fetters at all. They're good training tools, and they're incredibly durable. But you guys have taken a different approach, and you've really revolutionized the way that people look at fetters. And I'm not gonna bring up HEMA 3.0, but there is some like some very pointed logic and wisdom that came from that approach and the idea of what you guys were kind of coming at with your light fetter. So let's talk about Sigi and what the vision is for Sigi swords.
So Sigi as a very like rough idea started back in 2009 or 2010, but it wasn't Sigi back then. I would never imagine that I would ever like do swords, but back then I approached Pavel Moc, which you also might know, because like he creates wonderful stuff, and he's also a great guy. Yeah. So I approached Pavel Moc because I love the things that he was doing, and I also like him as a person. He's like a very fun person to be around and like just talk to, like a very interesting guy. And I approached him and I asked him if he wants to cooperate with us on creating feathers for HEMA, right? Feathers back then were starting. There were Encifers were relatively new and becoming widespread. There was the unsuccessful experiment of Hanwei or the early Hanwei. Regeni was just starting. I also remember like handling some of their like very first feathers, and I was like really happy with them when I handled them like all those many years ago. So I approached Pavel if he wants to cooperate. It took a year or two for him to come around, because he was like, I can't be like the Chinese, like do stuff en masse, and do it so cheaply. I want to create art. And I told him, but Pavel, but this is the future. And he was like, no, not for me. And then in a year or two, he came around and he was like, oh, Martin, can we meet again? So I would like to do these feathers. So I met with Pavel and we created his feather shirts, which are still available. Like they were bit different back then. So if you held the prototypes, like they were really good and they were really close to Sigi in many ways, like mainly the philosophy behind them. But it was difficult because Pavel is not like a company, like an enterprise. It's more or less like alone, maybe with a guy or two, and he could never keep up like properly with the demands because of so many issues. So then after a few years, I was very lucky to meet because I'm not alone in Sigi, of course. There are I have two more partners, Jakub and Ondrej, and both of them were part of my school. And at one point, we were getting drunk in some bar. Back in 2000,
ideas come from.
Yeah, back in 2018, and like Ondrej is he's an engineer, or he's like a material engineer, so he's got like almost a PhD because he left his PhD studies because of Sigi, and Jakub was extremely skilled, and he's extremely skilled in production, and we were just sitting around, and we're like, guys, well, why won't we make our own swords, right? And we're like, of course, yeah, make swords. And then the next day when we woke up, we were like, yeah, let's try it. So we met for a few rounds of communication, and I told them like I will go into it, and I will even like sponsor the initial phases, and I will be like really happy if this works out, but under one condition, and that condition is we want to make the best swords. So unless we're making the best swords, I'm not doing it. And they were like super motivated, and so we started. Well, I don't think our idea was that much different from ideas of any other sword makers. We want to have our own yachts, to own our own islands, and all the things connected to it. But all the sweet HEMA monies, coming from everywhere. So some guys do crypto, we do swords. But yeah, we weren't really happy with the choices that were available back then. Like I'm not talking like the guys are doing anything back. Quite the opposite. Quite the contrary. Like we have so many good swordsmiths nowadays, but I always wanted to take this like to a different level. Some people are just doing swords as a vision of how a sword should look like, and what we are trying to do is like to make the vision of how a sword should behave, or what do we want from a sword. Again, there is this cliche that some people say like from swordsman to swordsman, etc., or from fencers to fencers, and we also say it because it's a good cliche. but I think our biggest advantage is that most of us are really fencers, and we fence with our stuff, and we had like a very particular vision, very particular like design in mind, and we wanted to get somewhere. All right, so it's maybe the lights are the latest of our endeavors in that regard, but we always wanted to push HEMA a little further, maybe to create some standardization. Okay, so today you've heard that Martin is crossing H from HEMA. Now you hear that I'm pushing standardization.
Sportification, yeah.
Absolutely. You're gonna crucify me. No.
Yeah.
No.
I mean, isn't that the final destination?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, but I will be reborn. But
no. Yeah.
No, I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid because I really stand behind my opinions, and I think that we need to take some serious steps if we want to be taken seriously. If we really want to think about about fencing as a hobby, sport, whatever you name it, we need to have some standards. We need to teach people, or like the general audience, to demand a certain quality, to demand certain qualities in swords, to want something particular. We need to teach them how certain things work together, like why certain swords are better for some things, etc. And I think Sigi is leading the way in a certain way in this, because we are really trying to push. We are not really just trying, like to copy some old designs or something that we don't really have any information about. We are trying to make the sword as a practical tool. And this is our philosophy, and only people are the judges of if we are doing this correctly. So yeah. I hope we are, and of course all of the things are just evolving.
Yeah, I think the general HEMA community forgot that, I think a year before you guys had released the Siggy King, which is, one of, probably, in my opinion, one of the swords that I most admire out of your collection. It's one of my favorites. Both the King and the Queen are just, aesthetically beautiful and incredibly functional as training tools, because they're what they're simulating, right? And I think that people have a tendency to fail to see that variety is the spice of life, and that some people are going to approach training in different ways. And as a manufacturer, you're supposed to provide the options that everybody can train to whatever level they want to train to. So providing a light fetter for the community, but also providing something like the Siggy King, which is great, especially for those who are studying early, if they're doing Fiore or early KDF stuff, if they're big Talhofer acolytes, you have a weapon that looks and acts very similar to historical weapons in that regard, but it is also not going to kill your training partner, which,
yeah, of course,
that's kind of the goal,
absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. The Siggy King is phenomenal. When you design weapons, it's always a tit for tat. So, ideally, everything would be perfect, but that's not how the world works. So,
right.
So for instance, if you want to have a sword like this or that, I don't know, if you want it to be as light as possible, it cannot be, as stiff as possible. If you want for it to be safe as possible, it cannot be as stiff as possible, etc., etc. It has to have a certain POB. So we are always trying to balance all of these, in some way that also fits for us. Also the older I get, the less I appreciate hard hits. So,
right.
so if it was up to me, everybody would be fencing with light swords. But luckily, unfortunately, it's not up to me. But yeah, this is what we're trying to do. We're really trying to offer as large variety as possible for everyone to be able to pick a sword of their choosing. But at the same time, of course, we're trying to push a certain philosophy. So it's not just about making anything, really anything. We could theoretically make anything, and we have made a lot of stuff, but we really want for our swords to be safe, and reliable and durable and stuff.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, we're gonna have to. We'll have to send you. We want more side swords. That's what we want.
Yeah.
Yeah, they are certainly coming, and we've already made maybe a dozen different prototypes of side swords. But nice. Right now, the thing that we are mostly concentrating on, and again, this is the problem, because a day has only 24 hours, unfortunately. So the thing that we are concentrating on is on speeding up the production even more. We already are making significant numbers, and our production is quite large. But in order to satisfy the demand as much as we can, we need to work on upscaling the production. So I think if everything will go right, the side sword should be available this year. Probably, the preliminary date would be Q3, meaning September or maybe October. We will see, but it's not exactly a priority, but it will be there one day. You have to be patient.
Well, we can certainly be patient. We really look forward to it. But I think we should probably wrap it up there, Martin. This has been an absolute treasure. I really appreciate you giving us the opportunity to come on and speak with us.
Thank you guys. It was really my pleasure in the first place. So thank you for inviting me, and I hope this podcast will be not my end. No. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on, Martin.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.